This is the second part of the sequence for this lecture, and I'm still going through the expressions of the bubonic plague. So in this, I'm sort of covering the science still. Here's a picture of the buboles, and I'm saying it wrong because I just can't say it right, but this is where the fleas would bite the people and then their lymphatic system was infected. It's really gross how it happens. And so what happens is that the fleas are infected with Yersinia pestis, and then they get strangled and they can't breathe, and it causes them to go into a feeding frenzy. And then wait for it, because it's really gross. They vomit the blood, regurgitating thousands of plague bacteria back into the feeding site. So yuck. At any rate, I'm going to quote to you the maybe most famous account of the European plague that started in 1347. This is an account by Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron. And in his introduction, he lived through it. He had many people that he loved in his life die of it. And so he writes about this expression of the buboles. Here we go. In men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the two said parts of the body, this deadly gavocciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous. As the gavocciolo had been and still was an infallible token of approaching death, so also were these spots on whomever they showed themselves. So that's, really horrifying. But that's only, that was actually the least deadly version of the way that this plague could be expressed. So another way that the plague could express itself was through septicemic contact. So if it got in the bloodstream. So no good there. Sepsis isn't good now. Sepsis with Yersinia pestis is really bad. And that also resulted in very, very quick death. And, very relevant for today's COVID-19 is the fact that it was a respiratory disease as well. If you got pneumonia, the pneumatic version of the plague, you did not live. It was really fatal, and it could be spread through coughing, just like COVID-19. So here I'm going to give a quote. This is from Ludwig Heilian. So he's writing around 1348, and he knew people, of course, that died. This is an account of the pneumonic version of the plague. It is said that the plague takes three forms. In the first, people suffer an infection of the lungs, which leads to breathing difficulties. Whoever has this corruption or contamination to any extent cannot escape, but will die within 2 days. And then he goes on to say that there's another form in which boils erupt under the armpits, and a third form in which people of both sexes are attacked in the groin. These categories are medieval, so now we would say that the buboles are the flea bite version of the plague. So there we are. That's about the science of the plague and the plague in history. What I want to do now is just place this contextually, because I have pointed out that the bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, rather, this bacteria, and I keep on saying Yersinia, sorry, Yersinia, it infects people throughout a lot of human history. Why is it so bad in 1347 when it comes to Europe? Well, there's a lot of different reasons that I want to go to. One is a conceptual reason that is often referred to by historians as the Malthusian crisis. So Thomas Malthus was a very famous economist writing around the time of the Industrial Revolution in England. And what he postulated, he was a mathematician, he postulated that the growth of a food supply is always going to be slower than the growth of a population. So you have enough food, that means people have sex more, people then propagate more, and then there's not enough food, and warfare or famine or some disaster brings down that population again. these are predictions that haven't proved true completely for the modern era at all, specifically for industrialized nations that have a lot of education. Instead, what tends to happen is that families don't have many children. But this was certainly the case in Europe in 1347, because it turns out that in the preceding 2 centuries, there had been an agricultural revolution that enabled the population to grow very rapidly. At first, this was expressed, this had a lot of positives for Europe in terms of economic growth. A lot of inventions enabled, like windmills, to be more used, and the food supply in general grow. However, by the early 1300s, a lot of the best lands of Europe had been depleted and pushed to the brink. And in fact, a very horrific famine existed and erupted in the early 1300s, so that people's immune systems, when the plague hit, were not ready to combat the disease. So I have here a picture of, this is a much later depiction of a disease called ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. So St. Anthony's fire, ergotism, is a horrific disease. It's something that grows on rye. You may have heard of it because sometimes people say that people that were involved in the Salem witch trials were accusing each other of seeing weird things, and maybe that's where, because they had ergotism. Ergotism does cause sometimes hallucinations, and in fact, the molecule of the pathogen is related to LSD. So this kind of disease was already around in European society when the plague hit, the real big one in 1347, and that's why it was so bad. So the big reason about why this plague killed off so many people is because the immune systems of populations were so depleted. They just had no reserves left when it came time for the plague to actually rear its horrific head. So then I'm talking about how it did come to Europe. So I mentioned earlier a scientific paper that recently was published talking about a single transmission point, perhaps in Eastern Europe and Russia. That's not what I'm talking about now. That's an earlier period about the transmission as it existed and spread from China to then parts of the Middle East, and then to where I am now. So in October of 1347, a very important city in Italy, Genoa, was involved in a lot of trading in the Mediterranean. And a ship from the plague-infected area to the east settled into port, and people can trace, like, oh, it came from there, and then it went to the next one, and then it went to the next one. So the disease spread very quickly, and people at the time were aware of it. I have the Silk Road there as a term because probably across the Middle East and the rest of Eurasia, one of the things that happened is the Silk Road served as a kind of transmitter. So for example, I'm a real fan of the Appalachian Trail. I love it. I'm on it every weekend, as people know. But now the Appalachian Trail caretakers are saying stay off the trails, because the trails are going to be this incredibly horrific way of transmitting COVID-19, and they're getting really overused as well, so it's bad for the ecology. But I'm just relating the situation now to the situation in the 14th century. So I want to mention a couple things about this transmission. I think it's interesting because very soon after it started, the European patterns of quarantining people developed. So the word quarantine refers to 40 days. It comes from the Italian words 40 giorni, 40 days, which is how long a ship eventually was supposed to wait in a harbor, or a conventional time. Sometimes it was less than that, but as a way of preventing the disease from spreading. So if you were from another area after the 1347 pandemic, quarantining became a thing. And I have here a picture of a site where patients were sent. So this is not dealing with ships. It is a place called Lazaretto Vecchio. And it's pretty interesting. This is a little tiny island off the city of Milan. And in 1374, it was opened up. Plague victims were just shuttled there. So unlike today, where hopefully we're trying to have a society that prevents 2% of the population, the figures are still in mobility now, but the estimates of people who get COVID-19 dying now are between 1.6% and 4%, but it really depends on a lot of factors. Regardless, what we're trying to do is prevent those people from dying, and we're doing it in the very unusual way of social distancing the healthy, so that we healthy people don't get it and then act as vectors to hurt other populations. That's different. In the medieval period, quarantining was about sending the sick people off. Oh, you're sick, go, and then you just go away from society. So the treatment of these people could be very horrific. So, for example, a visitor to Lazaretto Vecchio wrote about in the 16th century that it seemed like hell itself. Some who miraculously returned from that place alive reported, among other things, that at the height of that great influx of infected people, there were 3 and 4 of them to a bed. So, and I actually omitted the grosser parts of that passage. It just describes how horrific the different conditions were for this. Other types of ways of quarantining people included just sending them off into the woods, into little huts, and if they lived, they lived, and that would be it. So I want to talk about some ways that people thought that the plague was transmitted. And here we go. Okay, so I'm on this section of the outline about what medieval people thought caused the plague. I just described this, Yersinia pestis, causing the plague. But what did medieval people think it was? At the outset, we're going to establish that medieval hygiene was horrible. It's not as horrible as a lot of people stereotype it as. For example, I've heard 1,000 years without a bath. In fact, medieval people bathed. It wasn't until after the plague that there became an idea that your pores, when they got water in them, would open up, and that's how plague got into them. Then after the bubonic plague or the Black Death, after that, people stopped bathing as much. But medieval people did bathe, and yet they were also really unhygienic. They didn't know about germ theory. They had no idea about microbes. So they would have the chickens in with the rest of the household. They lived in cities with defecation all around very frequently. Like there's not the kinds of measures of hygiene that could keep people very safe. That's not what people thought caused the plague. There are different natural explanations that medieval people gave. When I say natural, I mean there were explanations that did not include God that medieval people thought caused the plague. These were wrong, but they were also not religious. And some people say, okay, historians want to say, well, maybe these astronomical explanations, they're bad, but on the other hand, at least it's an attempt to use the natural world to describe things rather than just saying everything is, no matter what, you can't figure out the explanation because it's all from God. Regardless, I'm going to describe the astronomical explanations. So when the plague happened, in France, King Philip IV had the faculty at the University of Paris prepare a kind of statement to explain what was going on. Why was it happening? At the universities in the medieval period, people would have studied medicine. And so there was a response, and it was almost completely in astrological terms. Astronomy and astrology were completely blended in the 14th century. So the report came out in 1348, and what it said was that there was a kind of conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter in Aquarius in March of 1345, and that is why it corrupted the air, and that is why the plague happened. So that's pretty fascinating. In fact, the name Black Death comes from a similar report. There's a Latin poem talking about like I didn't write it down, but it's like on a banquet from Saturn. And it too locates the origin of the plague in terms of astrology. So I'm going to talk about the miasma theory. Maybe we've heard of this theory. I have a great picture for that. This is a mask, and I think a lot of these plague masks, you know, we see them and they're more steampunky than were actually practiced in, especially in the 14th century. But nevertheless, it gets across a point. Sometimes people say, oh, what they would have done is doctors wore these masks and they would have stuffed them with good smelling herbs like lavender. And that was because if you didn't smell the plague, then it couldn't get you. So this is the miasma theory, and ideas about smells causing plague predominate until the microscope, until after Florence Nightingale used to put bleach on and all around so that people would smell the bleach instead of the disease. This idea of smell causing disease is prominent. I think it's interesting as I'm lecturing now, report, and I really feel like I want to say this with all caution because it's totally preliminary, but there was a report out of the UK that maybe asymptomatic people with COVID-19 have a symptom where they can't smell. So I thought that just was an interesting connection. I want to also say something else about the smell thing. So a lot of us in high school learned that Ring Around the Rosie was from the plague. The idea is that the rings were the buboles that marked you, and then Pocketful of Posies, that smell. You'd have these nice smelling flowers to try to prevent the plague. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down is because you're dying, and that's the Catholic idea of Lent. From ashes you come from, and to ashes you will return. Well, that song isn't actually from the 14th century. It's from probably a plague response, but it's later than that. Sorry, Santa Claus isn't real either, but maybe Robin Hood is. So here we go. So I wanted to, oops, my notes dropped. A lot of what I'm trying to say is based on relatively recent research, and so I think it's pretty cool to keep up with that. Okay, well, besides miasma and besides astrology, there's another explanation, and this is sin. So here we're getting away from the natural causes of plague and into a kind of religious cause. And so here we go. The flagellants, you've probably heard of it. Oh, I didn't show you this. So I just want to show you this. This is kind of cool. This is a Roman painting. And I picked it out because there is an early account of a person named Varro who writes in a little text about how you should design your estate. And one of the things you have to be careful of is planting your estate in swamps, because there could be it's a only used once in this time period Latin word, it's tiny small invisible animals that could infect you, and that often is cited in early germ theory statements, but it didn't go anywhere. It's just a one-off. That is just a cool tangent. Okay, so going on to the flagellants. This is a copy of a manuscript. So this is an Italian manuscript, and it shows the flagellants, an idea that was really common in the time of the plague was that it was affecting people because of people's sinful nature. Something interesting about medieval conceptions of Christianity was that they were more communally oriented than maybe modern American sensibilities. So if a community had sinned, then you could suffer or atone for that sin as an individual, and it would help the whole community. And it's pretty interesting. This practice of flagellation was to cause a kind of penance. So you'd whip yourself with these cords. I'm going to quote this is John Froissart. In the year of grace, 1349, the penitents went about, coming first out of Germany. They were men who did public penance and scoured themselves with whips of hard knotted leather with little iron spikes. Some made themselves bleed very badly between the shoulders, and some foolish women had cloths ready to catch the blood and smear it on their eyes, saying it was miraculous blood. The object of this penance was to entreat God to put a stop to the mortality, for in that time there was an epidemic of plague. And I think this is pretty horrific self-harming practices, and I definitely don't want to lose sight of that. On the other hand, I think that it is a basic human nature to want to feel a sense of control. And that's exactly what the flagellants could get. I mean, if you feel like you're going to be actually helping and you're going to be stopping this horrific death around you by hurting yourself, well, that's a lot more sort of sympathetic of a view. At any rate, the church hierarchy, so the Pope, the papacy, the bishops underneath the Pope, they didn't in general support flagellation, and at different times tried to put a stop on it. But it was a popular thing that ordinary people and aristocrats did too. A lot of there's accounts of very wealthy people like sort of stripping down their jewels and joining the flagellants in that kind of self-harming. Well, I want to talk about the effects. I want to make a connection here. So I'm going to talk about the effects of the plague, and this is going to be a larger lecture, or a larger portion. So I'm going to stop this video in a second, but I want to just say that the first point, scapegoating, is also about the origins of the plague. So there's a connection there. And yeah, so you can go to the third video.